In 1877, the United States government published an official report trying to explain something that had nearly destroyed farming across an entire region of the country. The cause wasn't drought. It wasn't disease. It wasn't even weather. It was insects, an estimated 3.5 trillion of them moving as a single swarm. In July of 1875, a swarm was measured at roughly 198,000 square miles, an area larger than the entire state of California, all of it airborne at once. Farmers across the Great Plains watched daylight genuinely dim as it passed overhead. In the next few minutes, you'll see exactly what these swarms actually did to the farms in their path, and then something stranger, how a species this massive vanished from the Earth within about 30 years, in a mystery science still hasn't fully solved. This is documented history, a federal government commission, entomologist field reports, and modern research trying to explain what actually happened. Here's the part most people never hear about: how this whole crisis actually started. It starts with a swarm nobody in Washington believed was real until the reports kept arriving. Across the American West, this species, the Rocky Mountain locust, bred in massive numbers through the high plains and river valleys. Here's the strange part: almost nobody expects. Farmers initially assumed a swarm this size would simply pass through in an afternoon. Some swarms did move on quickly. Others settled in for days, stripping a field down to bare dirt before moving to the next one. Government reports from the period describe crops disappearing so completely that some fields looked as if they had never been planted at all. Eyewitness accounts from the time describe the sound of a swarm landing as similar to a hailstorm hitting a roof. And it wasn't only crops. Documented accounts describe locusts eating leather harnesses, wool directly off the backs of sheep, and the salt-soaked wooden handles of farm tools. Crushed locusts made the rails so slick, railroad companies reported, that train wheels lost traction entirely. Some trains reportedly couldn't climb grades they normally handled without difficulty, stopped cold by a layer of insects underfoot. Picture that for a second: an insect small enough to hold in your palm, in large enough numbers, stopping a steam locomotive. Everything. That's what a swarm like this threatened for farm families who had just spent a season's savings on seed and land. What no one in Washington fully grasped, at least not at first, was the actual scale involved. Here's the part most people never hear about: how bad the actual numbers got. By 1875, reports of crop destruction across Kansas, Nebraska, Minnesota, and the Dakota Territory had become impossible for the federal government to ignore. In 1877, Congress authorized the U.S. Entomological Commission, led by entomologist Charles Valentine Riley, specifically to study the crisis and recommend solutions. Sit with that for a second. The federal government created an entire scientific commission because of insects. Riley and his colleagues documented swarm sizes that are still cited by entomologists today as among the largest aggregations of any animal ever recorded. Here's a detail worth pausing on. Riley's commission didn't just document the crisis. It tried, seriously, to find a way to stop it. One recommendation was coordinated burning of egg beds, done in the early spring before hatching. Another was elaborate mechanical trapping devices dragged across fields to catch locusts before they could feed. A third was simply plowing fields deep enough to bury the eggs, some effective in small areas, none capable of stopping a swarm that size. The single largest measured swarm, observed in 1875 by a Nebraska physician named Albert Child, was estimated to cover roughly 198,000 square miles. Entomologists have since estimated that swarm alone may have contained somewhere around 3.5 trillion locusts, weighing a combined total in the tens of millions of tons. Numbers at that scale are hard to hold in your head, so here's a simpler way to think about it. It wasn't a large swarm passing overhead. It was closer to a temporary, moving ecosystem, briefly larger than most American states. Here's where the story usually stops in most retellings, but it doesn't stop there. If a species can multiply into the trillions, it seems reasonable to assume it would always be around in smaller numbers, even after a crisis like this one passed. What no one expected was the opposite. Within about 3 decades of the largest swarm ever measured, the Rocky Mountain locust was gone. Not reduced, not rare, functionally extinct. The last confirmed living specimens were collected in the early 1900s. After that, despite deliberate searching, none were ever found again. Museums still hold preserved specimens from before the collapse, physical proof of an animal that used to exist in the trillions. The stranger fact is that entomologists spent decades genuinely puzzled by this. A species that had recently existed in numbers large enough to darken the sky over multiple states had simply stopped existing, and nobody had a confirmed explanation why. Notice what makes this genuinely strange. Mass extinctions usually take generations to unfold, driven by slow environmental change. This species went from among the most numerous animals on the continent to completely gone within the span of a single working lifetime. But that's not even the most interesting part of what modern research has found. For decades, the extinction of the Rocky Mountain locust was treated as an unsolved mystery in entomology. The most detailed modern research on the question comes from Jeffrey Lockwood, an entomologist at the University of Wyoming, who spent years trying to reconstruct what actually happened. Here's the last piece of this most retellings skip entirely. Lockwood's approach involved something unusual. Studying old museum specimens and even preserved locust remains found frozen inside glaciers to reconstruct the population's history. His leading theory is almost uncomfortably simple. The locust's outbreak swarms ranged across the entire Great Plains, but its permanent breeding population appears to have depended on a much smaller set of specific river valley habitats in the Rocky Mountains. Those exact river valleys were also some of the first land settlers plowed, irrigated, and converted into farmland during the same decades the swarms were devastating the plains. Here's the detail that makes this land differently. The very crisis the locusts were causing may have driven the agricultural expansion that then quietly destroyed the specific ground they needed to reproduce. Farmers, without knowing it, may have been eliminating the locusts' only reliable nurseries at the exact same time the locusts were destroying their crops. This theory hasn't been proven with absolute certainty. Some details of exactly how and why remain genuinely open questions in the research, but it remains the most credible, evidence-based explanation entomologists currently have for one of the fastest-known extinctions of an extremely abundant species. Here's the part worth sitting with if you've never heard this story before. A creature that once formed swarms larger than entire states, capable of stripping a season's harvest down to bare dirt, may have been erased not by poison, not by predators, but by the accidental side effects of the same farming it was devastating. Notice what actually survived from this crisis. Not the species itself, but the federal scientific infrastructure built to study it. The Entomological Commission, created to fight the Rocky Mountain locust, became part of the foundation for the agricultural science agencies that still study crop pests today. A crisis that once darkened the sky over half a continent ended not with a solution, but with a silence nobody fully expected or has ever completely explained. Sit with that for a second. We solved the mystery of what the swarms did, but not fully why they stopped existing at all. That's the real story, documented in federal reports, entomologist field notes, and research that's still being refined today. If you want more of these, the real documented history behind the crises that shaped American farming, subscribe to The Quiet Farmer and tell us in the comments, had you ever heard of the Rocky Mountain locust before this?